Teresa Gard and Sophia McLean are literary arts students here at Evergreen, and they'll be introducing our leaders for the morning.
Hi. Move this a little. Hi. Okay. I'm so excited and nervous and grateful to have the opportunity to introduce, whoa, that's moving, Michel Mejia to you all today, and to have been given the chance to interact with his work in preparation for this introduction. Mejia is the author of numerous stories and novellas, as well as the novels Forgetfulness and most recently Tokyo. He is the editor-in-chief of the Western Humanities Review, a co-founder at Nine Bark Press, and a teacher of creative writing at the University of Utah. Theorist Felix Guattari writes about how discourses and realities never cease to interfere with each other, that writing isn't so much the question of where are you speaking from, but what is it that begins to speak through you in a given situation or context. Mejia's practice makes him the medium through which multitudes speak and mingle on the page. His work does not observe, but instead orchestrates the interferences of discourses and realities, blurring the lines between word and world. For me, crossing paths with Michel Mejia has been timely as a writer working with problems of places, infrastructures, intertextualities, and the ideal of the commons. Mejia's kaleidoscopic collage work is certainly both a literary commons and a commonplacing practice on steroids. The patchwork therein creates, to borrow and modify a phrase from novelist Gail Scott, a community of language, where borrowed writing is cleaved, sometimes down to the level of the word, and remixed almost but not quite beyond recognition. In an interview with the collagist, Mejia traces his practice at least back to the cento, a poetic patchwork in which lines lifted from other poems are repurposed and remixed in a different environment, creating something else, something new through juxtaposition. He equates this mashup method to a kind of literary puzzle, which he calls exhausting and tedious, but also fun, like a game. Mejia's work turns related questions around and around, investigating texts and language from different angles, altering his approach each time. His writing exists in constant movement between the realms of the real and the absurd. About his own shifting intentions, he writes that he first worked to create an environment of interesting language, and then to create action and narrative, as well as narrative suggestion, or, as he writes, a kind of spatialization of narrative, like entering an installation at a museum or gallery. His curatorial writing practices, and conveniently for me, his website, ask the questions, where does the text end? What is its proper arrangement? When will it happen or happen again? When will I no longer be experiencing the reading of the text? Without further ado, please welcome Michel Mejia.
Sorry. Thank you for that amazing introduction. When you mentioned Guattari, I was scared. That's a lot of pressure. For all of us, I think. But just let me say thanks very quickly to Miranda and to Shah Osha and Julie Ron for setting up this event, and thank you all for coming out. I'm gonna get started very quickly here, and I'll sort of pick up or come back to you shortly. But first, let me get this operating. Sorry. A couple of quick notes before I start. The images that you're going to see are all images that appear in this book, Tokyo, that I'm going to be reading from. The black and white photographs I took, and the color images are by a Japanese artist named Yamaguchi Akira that I met with in Tokyo, and he also did the cover image. There we go. Let's just start over here, sorry. Okay. All right, and then the other note is that this first bit that I'm reading is from a report written in the mid-90s by a Japanese businessman, Ito Sadahara, and it mentions during the course of this his wife, Sato, from whom he is separated at the time when he was writing. Saburo and I entered the Tokyo Central Wholesale Market at approximately 7:45 on the morning of 21st April, Skiji was hurtling toward the final half of its day. Bicyclists and tares careened through the crowd, the men and the machines all seeming to balance equally great numbers of cages, crates, and boxes. Cranes groaned on the docks, loading and unloading hauls of flash-frozen fish from every sea, lake, river, pond, bay, and ocean around the world. Redfish and Atlantic cod, albacore, fugu, king and queen mackerel, flounder, swordfish, shark and salmon, herring, roughy, walleye pollock, tuna. Lights flashed and sirens wailed. Engines and hydraulic systems hummed, creaked, and whined to their business, their sounds so in harmony with the human pandemonium that it seemed every object, every person, every breeze blowing ripples through the market's bright banners was somehow driven by the operations of a vast and covert system of flywheels, pistons, and spinning shafts. The grandeur of this spectacle made me forget Sato for the moment, as well as the bother of having to leave my office. Skiji whirled around me, spread itself open before me, a voluptuous garden, solicitous, overripe with fish, meat, and produce, and the scent of 2,000 flowers, with humanity, buyers and sellers, the seemingly innumerable rows of stalls and tables and stands and workers stretching away into the distance in every direction, a great organic machine, oblivious to the existence of a larger world circumscribing it, regulating its systems. There is no air in Skiji, Minister, only water, and one must learn to breathe it to survive. Salty bay fog and the fresh spray of hoses, mist rising from the defrosting fish, steam from a tea kettle. My socks grew damp as the wet sheen of the cement found its way through the unprotected seams of my soles. A pair of spirited women sifted through bins of beans and mushrooms, while nearby a man shook his head and washed shrimp. And there were younger ones, laughing as they chopped the heads off salmon, joking about the previous night's Swallows baseball game. There were buckets of clams and oysters, quivering sardines, tanks of lobsters. From every restaurant came the smell of tempura and yosanabe, oyakodon and kabayaki. Young boys and women hand-rolled sushi for floor managers, reading the newspaper on their break. They were all new men, these managers, a generation or more younger than myself, and I knew I would never know them. There was a time when, at every step through Skiji, I would have encountered a friend or an acquaintance. That was only a short while ago. The comings and goings of people in my business, as well as yours, Minister, are infinitely more swift and unambiguous than the fluctuations of the catch. But as quickly as I was delighted by Skiji that morning, I became resentful of it. This beautiful garden I had been admiring as if from a distance, the distance of Uokai's 19th floor, through an autumn haze of nostalgia, was, in fact, as it always had been, a wilderness, unmanaged, writhing and unrestrainable, lacking any sense of moderation, a severely infectious condition that was evident in the afflicted countenances all around me. A condition that was, perhaps, as much to blame for my loss of Sato as any fickleness in her character or any act of seduction. If it was true, as I believed, that I had been sharing my wife with another man, I could not have been doing so with any equity, and this seemed even more shameful than sharing itself. It is at such moments of despair, Minister, that the most devastating strain of regret sets its teeth in me. There, caught in the market's whirlpool heart, my palm recalled the weight of Sato's breast. My nose knew the scent of her skin. The taste of her body slid across my tongue. Beneath my raincoat, held fast against my ribs by the pressure of my arm, the portrait was still hidden, the frame's sharp edges stabbing me, the cool glass and lacquer giving me a sudden chill through my shirt. For the first time since receiving the news of Sato's collapse, perhaps even since her departure, I felt fully awake, grotesquely aware of myself in the world, this parallel world that I had never known existed. I saw myself reflected in the fishy eye of a convex mirror, alone, foreshortened, shivering in damp ignominy. I needed to get away, out to the street, but when I turned to Saburo, he had disappeared. Looking on every side, I found myself boxed in by stacks of wire cages full of frogs, all heaped upon each other's bloated, filthy bodies, unmoving, indifferent, unblinking, staring out in whichever direction they'd happened to be facing when they were packed for shipment. But for the slight movements of their breathing, I would not even have thought them alive. One particular set of eyes stared out at me. They knew me. Did I cry out at this horror, Minister? I meant to. Indeed, I covered my ears to block out a prolonged and horrific keening that sent the frogs into a panic. I heard my name in their wild croaking and the strange rasping they made as they struggled to escape their fate. Then they were gone, spirited away by a great golden forklift. And again I heard my name. It was Kimura, standing there in front of me where the frogs had been, Saburo at his side, and though it took me a moment to acknowledge them, they seemed to take no notice of my agitation. The tuna cutter, Grizzly in his spattered, slimy apron, inclined his head in greeting and motioned for me to follow him to our tuna stall. I obeyed. Though he and Saburo exchanged a few short words along the way, neither attempted to brief me further about the tuna affair. 3 or 4 men were at work cutting up a large bluefin tuna when we arrived, and I stopped to observe them. The fish was short but bulky. The healthy red meat of its belly was well marbled and looked particularly valuable. It appeared to be a very good buy, and the sight of it, as well as the air of deference I'd sensed from the workers when I arrived, helped to restore my composure. Indeed, watching the crew dismantle the fish with well-rehearsed ease made me ponder the speed with which chaos may turn to order, dread to tranquility, flesh to food, and vice versa. These seeming oppositions, separated only by a thin membrane of circumstance, unstable, contiguous states we inhabit and abandon at the whim of some force or condition beyond our control, as readily as water turns to ice, turns to vapor, and back again. Is it possible, Minister, that truth, too, is such a substance, not developing, as we may believe, from blind ignorance toward clarity and understanding, but rather suffering its nature to be more constantly and randomly remade? What was the problem? I asked Kimura finally. This fish looked excellent. He pointed to the back corner of the stall where another larger fish lay on a low wooden table beneath a makeshift canvas awning. The working men looked up at us, their gaze following the direction of Kimura's silent gesture. They looked back at me, then set to hacking the spine out of the open fish before them. Though I did not know what to make of these glances, they seemed to me more indicative of the seriousness of the situation than anything I had seen or heard thus far that morning. The second tuna was massive, looking to be well over 500 kilos. It would bring a very fine profit if the meat was as good as that of the first. Except for a slight strangeness in its eyes, the fish appeared to have no visible defects. I asked Kimura again, more pointedly, what the problem was, and I let it be known that it irritated me to see such a valuable fish being allowed to sit and stink. Kimura motioned for Saburo and me to stand closer together over the tuna to block the view from the adjoining stalls. Giving me one final glance in preparation, he kneeled and shoved his thick fingers into the tuna, wedging them into the cut he had already made in its belly to have it. Then he lifted. Minister, I do not have the words to describe the mixture of shock, sickness, and amusement I felt at what I saw when Kimura opened that tuna. I say amusement because as my initial horror receded, I was certain, more certain than when Saburo had first appeared in my office that morning, that someone was playing a joke. This feeling did not last long. Inside was the body of a woman, naked, gutted, perfectly halved, just like the fish from crotch to crown. She was not a midget nor a girl, but a miniature adult female in her late 30s, 40 at the most, fully formed and developed with long black hair, her body perfectly proportioned to fit inside the skin of the fish. The tuna itself had no inner organs, no skeleton. It was apparent that its skin served only as an outer covering for the small woman inside, and that what flesh there was to the fish was only a kind of padding to fill out its shape so that it, the tuna, gave no sign to either fish or fisherman that it carried a woman inside, that it was anything other than an average bluefin tuna. She was beautiful, Minister. The entire construction was masterful, so much so that it seemed shockingly organic. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the thing, even now I am uncomfortable with the term monster, was the naturalness of the woman's expression of anxious surprise. The slight tension remaining in her muscles, traces of emotions or instincts that seemed both human and less than human, heightening the ambiguity of her origin, her species. I had never seen her before, of course, this small woman, yet her features begged me to recall a name or a similar face, perhaps that of someone I'd encountered once briefly in a crowd or seen on television. My initial physical sickness evolved into a spiritual one. Curiously, this death felt to me like a crime. Are there others like this? I asked Kimura. There were not. I asked Saburo how much he had paid for it. 563,000, he said. I cannot authorize the disposal of so costly a fish without consulting Senkai-san. I told Kimura and Saburo to wrap up the tuna and lock it in a freezer. Instruct the other men not to say a word to anyone, I told Kimura. Tell them to say nothing, or... But I did not know how to finish. What was the extent of the danger? With what could I threaten them that would keep them from telling even their wives? I turned to watch the men working. None of them spoke or looked up, though I was certain they felt my eyes upon them. It seemed to me that they were all anxiously anticipating the moment later that day when, their work complete, they would pass beyond the borders of Tsukiji and perhaps at a supper table, perhaps at a bar, at least one of them would reveal something of our secret catastrophe. Nothing could prevent this. I turned back to Kimura. Just tell them, I said. Tell them to say nothing. So I mentioned that was written in the mid-90s, which is true, by a Japanese businessman who works at Tsukiji, the Tokyo Central Wholesale Market, the largest fish market in the world, which is untrue. I mean, I am not Japanese, I have no Japanese heritage, but I was so fascinated by Tsukiji as a place, which I had read about in a National Geographic article about the time that I wrote this, that I was just compelled to write this story, just thinking about how the fish market, if you don't know, most of the work is done from about 6 p.m. until noon the next day. So the thousands of people who work there live this kind of reverse life where they, work all night and they sleep during the day. And it occurred to me, like, how that might affect the personal life of someone, sort of deeply involved with that work. And that's where the story started, with this separation between Ito-san and his wife Sato, who was Sansei, Japanese American. And somewhere along the lines, this image that I kind of ended with here of a woman in the body of a tuna came to me. I'm not really quite sure where that came from, but it happened, and that sort of sent the whole project in this other direction. Like, this was this mystery that occurred, and I still have no answer, not only for where it came from, but what it means. Right? I worked very hard to create the semblance of authenticity here, right? Of this sort of like authentically Japanese voice, to the point, what I wanted was for an English-speaking reader to read this text and imagine that they were somehow magically seeing, English in place of Japanese, that this would be read as a Japanese text. I don't really know where I got the idea of what a Japanese text was, except to sort of read deeply in Japanese fiction. I was reading sort of historical texts, social, cultural texts. I was doing a lot of research just to try to create this realistic Tokyo and a realistic Japanese voice. And it worked. I don't know what you thought of it, but at the time that I wrote that, I had never been to Tokyo. I had never been to Tsukiji. All I had ever seen were the photographs in that National Geographic and a few other things. But people who had been to Tokyo asked me, when were you there, right? And my first response as a fiction writer is to think, great, it worked. But then, it kind of lingered, much like this fish with a woman in it. The whole idea just kind of lingered with me, like I was pulling something over on people. And it wasn't like I felt bad that I had appropriated Japanese voice exactly, but I just wasn't sure what I meant by doing that, performing that appropriation. So much like this tuna with a woman with it, the project really stuck with me over several years. And when I started working on the project that was mentioned in the introduction, this appropriation project, where I had, this was maybe 10 or more years later, I had this idea of creating a new fiction just by appropriating text from other texts, right? And I would add no words of my own. I would just sort of remix text from a bunch of different things. And I mean, where do those texts come from? I don't know. I looked over at my bookshelf, and there were many of the texts that I had used to research this initial report. So I thought, I'll use those. I just randomly chose text from those books and started creating a new text. And I realized that what I was doing was I was giving all that research that I had done, that I had actually submerged through that fiction, that initial fiction, and erased, in a sense. I was giving those texts an opportunity to speak for themselves. And I was super interested by, how that changed the voice, what kind of voice was coming out of that. I was still arranging the words, but they were not my words. They were not words I would have chosen sort of naturally. They were not my sort of like inherent fictional vocabulary, as it were. So as I started putting that together, I thought, well, this could be an interesting companion piece to the report. And then I thought, well, it would be interesting to actually go to Tsukiji, go to Tokyo. I still had not been, and sort of see, in some sense, sort of what I got wrong, what I got right, and think about, what that meant at the end of the day, what that told me about the project as a whole. So I did go to Tokyo for a month a few years back, and spent a lot of time at Tsukiji. As I said, most of these photographs, or all of the photographs, came from that time. And I included them in the book because I wanted them to serve, in a sense, a kind of documentary purpose, right? Like, here is the real Tokyo, supposedly. I mean, at every step, this book is trying to assert a Tokyo. But increasingly, as I came back to the project and developed it further, it acknowledged more and more openly that none of these Tokyos are real. Right? None of these Tokyos are the Tokyo. I don't know what the Tokyo is. These images from Yamaguchi-san were intended in some way to be that Tokyo, to ask someone from Japan who lives in Tokyo to depict Tokyo as he sees it, right? To sort of present a Tokyo that I couldn't see as a Westerner. He based them, as you can probably tell, on passages from that original report, which were translated into Japanese by a Japanese translator in Tokyo. He interpreted those translations as in the way that he wished, which is exactly what I wanted. But again, it's not the real Tokyo. There is no real Tokyo here ever. So what the book does is, in the second and third parts, is to go back to that Tokyo that I started with and, ask over and over again, like, where is this coming from? Who is this Westerner, right? I mean, is Ito even Japanese? Well, no, he's not, right? And the book starts to recognize that. He must be a Westerner interpreting Japan. And what is that, what's the draw of that interpretation? What is the impulse to interpret, to see Japan in that particular way? So I'm going to finish up here with another section. This is from the third part of the book, which is similarly a fiction. It features two characters in particular: M, who may be who is a Westerner, is an American, who may be an author, maybe a filmmaker, and S, who is a Japanese that may be male or female. If anything, S is a kind of like embodiment of desire, right? The desire that that both the West and Japan sort of see in each other, right? Sort of a potential lover in a sense, but also an answer. So you'll see in this section the ways in which the third part of the book starts to revisit earlier themes and images and start to sort of reinterpret them, and in a sense asking questions about sort of where they come from and what they mean. So this is from part 3. But when he arrives, it's already too late. The key he'd been given, wrapped in thin blue paper with wisteria blossoms, opened the door, room 2082. Just as the note had said it would, a room of shelves crammed tight with books on fish, market histories, poetry, novels, manga, an old wooden desk, and a shabby central table covered with more volumes, scattered with newspapers and industry magazines. In the back room, the Japanese room, he passed through the tokonoma, through the secret door into the mirrored hall where S. But there's nothing, no one, just the largest tuna the detective has ever seen, lying on its side on the bare concrete floor, lit by a single dangling bulb, light reflecting harshly on the lacquer-like sheen, the defrosting fish's damp surface. Its belly sliced open, revealing fine meat, the severed crescent of its tail shoved up into the gap where its gills once were, a commonplace at Skiji, though in this context it seems like a message, a threat of humiliation. So, they'd expected him. But what about S? Had they really brought her here, as she'd predicted? Or was it all a setup? Had she been in on it? He turns in place, scanning the reflections as if one might move independently of him, as if someone might be back there, behind any one of them, watching. But what else can he do? He can't ease up. The long time has started. He circles the fish, the floor seeming to suck at the soles of his shoes. His legs feel weak. Who would sacrifice such an enormously profitable specimen like this? Only a clan, of course. A corporate conspiracy, a diverse criminal syndicate with money and influence and nothing to lose. Peering into the fish's upturned milky eye, he sees nothing unusual. The enormous body, wide enough, long enough to hold a human, carefully folded, knees hugged to chest as infants once were, the archaeologists say, back in the Jomon period, arranged for burial in clay jars. As the notion blossoms, that characteristic crease, familiar to his fans, deepens between his thick eyebrows as he drops to all fours, peering into the fish's open mouth, trying to illuminate that abyss with the faint light of his cell phone, just barely revealing inside another duller sheen, some unnatural object, a solid mass edged with black fur. Or hair. The mime of grief he begins now is exquisite, very Japanese. Stamping feet and delicate hand gestures, he extracts a fan from his inside coat pocket, leaving nothing to the imagination but the sound of a koto. After a few minutes, the interpreter is about to step in, but I stop him. Let him finish, I say. He's exploring. Do whatever it is you people do, I'd told the interpreter to tell the actor earlier. Here is your motivation. And then I recited the line I'd been worrying in my head ever since you last wrote, the line you signed off with. All they'll find in the locker at Kamiyacho is fear and whale meat. The same line spoken, recited by the young man whose call had awakened me last night, my first night in Tokyo, before the line went dead, my Japanese phone. Who was he, and how had he gotten the number, unless you... The interpreter stared at me and as he translated, as if maybe I'd misspoken, but the actor accepted my direction without alarm, the crease between his eyebrows suggesting he'd even been anticipating this, as if the line was some kind of code I'd been meant to deliver to him, a code that might permit my entry into... Or that he, the actor, was part of this same conspiracy into which I'd been groping my way all along during those nights online, corresponding with you, sinking deeper and deeper into your whirlpool heart. On the flight over, I dreamt us going down in the dark into the black Pacific. How did I survive? And her, my wife, her flight went down too, the two of us taking up residence together, like Izanami and Izanagi on a fragment of charred fuselage, planting gardens across an archipelago of flotsam caught in the Pacific Gyre, cultivating radioactive fish and seedlings to feed the new Japan we'd create through our ritualized rutting, a race in our own likenesses, quite literally each face, each body only fractionally different from ours, so that it was impossible to tell one from... And there, even I, somehow, have become Japanese, while she looks, as she always has, like one of them. From beneath a red parasol, she speaks, and I understand every word about the process of fermenting indigo leaves into the tsukumo she's made to dye our hoppies. Or that was a film the Japanese next to me was watching. Kaoru, an accountant making his home in Portland now, headed home to some western suburb for the first time in 6 years, one historical scenario after another he watched. Samurai and Kamikaze, General Nogi and Empress Jingu, all the way from LAX to... Or it was the film I was writing. Or it's this one. What do you think? The interpreter whispers as the detective continues. I think I was hoping I'd spot her, maybe tomorrow at the arrivals hall, or later in the market crowd wearing the same green scarf and bug-eyed sunglasses, my surgical mask and salaryman suit disguised enough that I might follow her unnoticed to your rendezvous. Is it the Café Diamond, maybe, where you first met, by the Kaminariman? Or why not your apartment, crowded with novels, your translations of Mishima and Kawabata and Abe, all your Japanese books, every one a translation that gives you away as one of us, a gaijin after all. Wasn't it you that wrote, "You are destined to meet yourself waiting for the traveler"? You fraud. Wasn't it you that turned me on? Thank you.
I am very happy to welcome Anca Cristofovici to Evergreen today, a novelist, essayist, editor, poet, playwright, and translator. Cristofovici was born in Bucharest and defected to France in 1985. She teaches American literature and art at the University of Caen in France and is currently a visiting scholar at the Walter Chapin Simpson Center for the Humanities at the University of Washington, where she is working on a project studying artist books and independent publishers in the Pacific Northwest. Cristofovici composes in English, French, and Romanian, depending on the needs of the text. Her scholarly work includes Touching Surfaces, Photographic Aesthetics, Temporality, Aging, published in 2009, and she is the editor of the 2015 anthology, The Art of Collaboration, Artists, Poets, Books. She is interested in the translations, overlaps, and interstices between words and visual art, and often collaborates with artists, contributes to art catalogs, and comes to her fiction writing as a photographer does to a camera, with focused attention on people, objects, and their environments. Stella, her novel published in 2015, began in the late 90s as a project for assembling data and research, including oral histories and documentary films about Romanian testimonies to life under communist mechanisms. The title character has disappeared and then reappeared in a mysterious way. This is the experiential foreground to a totalitarian regime called the Perimeter of Fear, the context for the political complications and cultural traumas of Stella's disappearance. This disappearance and reappearance becomes an impossible object of focus for Stella's daughter Cora and Cora's partner Luca. The narrative cracks questioned through art and dreaming remain unanswerable. Attempted answers only widen gaps, move further into bewilderment. There is no way, this story suggests, to resolve the unresolvable. When asked about Stella's experimental surrealism, Cristofovici said in an interview with the Quarterly Conversation, "In everything I've read, the experiences of people in life-threatening situations struck me as experiments in staying alive. The narrative form of the novel, then, is only an adaptation to the character's shattered life course, the imaginative and emotional solutions they come up with. In the process of writing Stella, Cristofovici wondered how to bring the experiences of survival represented in her research to bear within a fictional framework. The response to her question comes in the form of poetic, choral, fragmentary language, indistinct from the content of imagination, dreams, and art making, which acts as a periscope through which the reader may view the historical material." In Talia Field's essay, Writing as Experimental Practice, she says, "I think the blank page for the experimentalist doesn't exist to be filled in the same way. Because form and content are indistinct, one does not conjure the work from the imagination as though it was detached from the world it emerges into." I feel this description is salient for Cristofovici's breadth of textual engagements. There's little separation between her habits in different genres. She is a creative essayist and a researcher novelist. She has remarked, "I've never experienced much anxiety of the blank page," and this is clear not only in her prolific cross-genre body of work, but also her methods, form indistinct from content. And now please welcome Anca Cristofovici.
Thank you so much. I'm so moved by your presentation. It's really wonderful. Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here, doubly pleased to be in an art environment because whatever I do, my characters are always artists. I think it just, I've been trying to find a different profession for the main character of the novel I'm working on now, and she just ends up to be an artist because just this is my life, this is my environment, and for me, and probably you will understand, life is not something over there on the other side of the street, but it's just another form of life. And it very often brings us scary life on and further. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased also to be able to read today with Michel Mejia, who is not only a wonderful novelist, but also my publisher, a wonderful publisher at that. It's been a privilege for me to work with him and Mindy Wilson, who is an editor, and Sandra Meek, who is a poet. My friends are very jealous too for me for having been able to work with the publisher who is 3 persons and such wonderful combination, a novelist and an editor and a poet. And it's wonderful. I remember 3 years ago when Stella was launched and I went for a reading in Salt Lake City, we were still talking with Michael about this novel, and it's really a privilege to be here today. And thank you very much for having brought us together. I have prepared a little presentation of Stella, but what you've done is so much better. So I think I will just say a few words about, okay. And I just click on the, okay. Just a few words about the images that you will see, which are mostly, not exclusively, dance, and what I will read as more of film. So the 2 characters that were mentioned, Cora and Luca, they are both artists, both defectors from the perimeter of fear, both artists. Cora is a dancer, and she has lost her mother at age 15 in a circumstance of political disappearances, and that is something that makes her not believe the fact of her mother's death. So she constructs a series of fantasies about what might have happened to her, and that was for me a way of introducing all that documentary material. Instead of making a big book of everyone's stories I have read or heard or seen, all these fantasies were synthesized in a few images, a few elements of each story that develop as Cora, and at a certain point together with Luca discuss or fantasize or dream the possibilities of what might happen to Stella. One of the possibilities is that she ran away from the perimeter of fear. In Romania, that was actually literally the verb that was used, not even ran away, they ran. Whispered, they ran, that is, they defected. And so she defects at a certain point and develops her dance. She was a dancer from a very young age, and her art, and meets Luca, who is an intermedia artist at a certain point. Now, the dance was very important for me in this novel, whose story has heavy political connotations, because I think of trauma very much as something that affects the body primarily. Whatever we can work out psychologically is not easy, but can be worked out, but the body never forgets or forgets. So all my creative efforts go in the sense of taking off weight of the body, and also taking the characters, taking them out of a circle of victimization, because this is, in all these stories of trauma, this is a way of keeping the character within the trauma. So having Cora work with her body and develop a technique that corresponds to her sense of freedom, both physical and mental and eventually geographical, was a way of working out these issues, even as there is no explicit reference to trauma in her discourse. One of the preoccupations on the political level for me was, again, not to do anything critical, not to limitate that to a specific country, but to try to understand a system which has affected many countries in the world outside of Eastern Europe, and to understand it also in terms of human nature, a little bit that what we heard last night about political situation in the United States today. What is there in the human nature that makes this system possible? And I had a kind of epiphany at a certain moment, reading a lot of material, that there was something extremely systematic and extremely rigid and mixed with a lot of chaos. And so there is this binary, paradoxical binary of the system, which is systematic and chaotic. And I've never done dance, but I've always been, for me, dance has always meant something that carries life further. And I've early on been familiar with American modern dance. And watching more and reading more about Merce Cunningham and John Cage, I found in their method flip over, a reversal of this binary, systematic and chaotic of the system. What they do, Merce in the choreography and Cage in this working with chance, is trying to grasp the forms that emerge from chaos. So that was a decisive moment for me that helped me bring that novel, which is based on a lot of negative energy and a lot of trauma, bring it in a space of light and the freedom, to which I hope to bring the reader, and not in a space of heavy space of trauma. Eventually, the characters evolve through light, even if the resolution is unexpected and not the one that we would expect in narrative terms. It's more in the sense of the trajectory. So this has to do with dance. These images are part of a longer series that I have used while I was writing as very much like a music playlist. They included a lot of images from Merce Cunningham choreographies, but others, like this image of a serial quality, because there is a serial quality in the narrative, which is one of the Muybridge photographs, and also video, a lot of video pieces. You will see some of Bill Viola's video pieces, which were extremely powerful. So for me, the images are not, I don't have a relationship of illustration. None of them appear as such in the novel, but there is something of an energy, of a material energy and of texture that I have absorbed. Luca is a multimedia artist, and when he defects, he comes across the border, she comes across 2 boxes of reels, which turn out to be surveillance secret police films. There were no video cameras at the time. And for some reason, he keeps carrying these boxes that didn't make much sense in his life at that point. And later on, when he settles, he will work them into a piece of art, and that has a very important role in the narrative. So I will read from the 2nd chapter of the novel, entitled Standing, Walking, Running, which is a hint to one of Merce Cunningham's choreographies, and very much of the movement pattern of the defector. The reels. I had other things on my mind at that time of trial and error after my one-way journey past the border, find a roof, some food, get a car going, get myself going, get the papers, appointments and deadlines and other appointments, papers of different colors allowing for different periods of residence in the new country for a different range of activities. 2 metal boxes of dark reels turn out to be of no help in such situations. They are no useful currency so far as I know. Yet if only as a reminder of the future promised by that unending night when I crossed the border, I've carried them along with me, storing them in basements, backstreet sublets, walk-ups, interim studios, trusting there was some material on the reels I could use as objets trouvés. Wasn't it what they were after all? I did consider the possibility that they'd been left there for me to find, but who'd have put them on my way? And why? Or someone might have just lost them on their way out of the homeland, their thoughts as frozen as mine, their chest as tight. The lost keeps the found in equipoise, said a tobacco-colored newspaper clipping I had tucked in one of the boxes, because at one point perhaps it helped me make sense of my attachment to a hank of celluloid. Years passed. I became less of a nomad. Resting on a shelf in what was now my permanent studio, the boxes were covered in dust of many varieties, the reels lagged behind current technologies, parts of them defaced by mute chemical reactions. And when I finally unwound them, what was there to see? Not much. Yards of people going about ordinary tasks, type-lettered captions on celluloid spelling out the time at which they left the house and why precisely, and when precisely they returned, hour, minutes on the dot, with whom they had changed a word, a gaze, or not, how many boxes of matches they had bought, how many packs of chalk or pairs of underwear, above or under the counter, local or foreign brand, how many pounds of sugar, oil, salt. Yes, salt more than anything else. But what, I wondered, were they all carrying under the burden of those bags of rare victuals, under their stiff winter coats? What kinds of innerness? What lining of fear, diffidence, humiliation? What moments of sudden awareness? As they came and went, sinking into the unending piles of snow, shoulders bent, arms unhinged by the weight they carried, their lives turned around the spindle, invisible like the eavesdropping microphones and eagle-eyed cameras that tracked the black and white women, men, children, zooming in on every facet of their lives by day or by night. There must have been something small, thou, in each person's pocket, around the neck, in the lining of the rough coat, a tiny rusty key, a photograph, faded, dog-eared, a piece of cloth, a silent watch, some reminder of who they once were, they or their parents, a friend or a cellmate, leftovers of what they've been, buried, burned, dropped in the gutters to stay above suspicion, a pack of letters, a diary, a wedding ring, a handful of golden coins. The rest of their lives they carried on their shoulders. From where I was in time and space, that spectrum of grays and browns, lead, ash, thirsty earth, bloodless bone, loaded sky, seemed out of place, futile and fake at that. And yet, wouldn't I know it wasn't? Would my skin not still itch at the sight of them in their rough coats, shoveling piles of snow? Was I not still wearing the rash on the back of my neck? Did I not still feel the weight of my conscript coat, its plastic collar, hear the inner conflagration of early mornings when I slipped my hands into the dark tunnel of its stiff sleeves? Would not my heartbeat be quickened by the stifling muteness of those misty figures, by their thick, slow motion and restrained gestures, their ghostly steps? Would my chest not still tighten at the possibility of sub-technical error hurling me back into that film, just when I'd safely got at the end of the paperwork releasing me from its frames? In spite of my unease, I was far away and safe, and yet I could not keep the reels from running on and on, not let those figures plod vainly in that landscape perverted by mud and wreckage. No, I could not let the dark, forlorn silhouettes down. I owed them some dignity. They all deserved my benevolent gaze before I slipped them back into the oblivion of their boxes. That they'd come into my hands was not a matter of choice, but an accident. Still, it was for me to help them step into another life, no matter that to them, wherever they were by now, my fervor didn't mean much anymore. Then my eyes fell on a gate so unlike the others, one that reached me from a whole other story. Even if having come this far, I did not expect that woman's silhouette could have once crossed my life. Why did that part of the film revolve in my mind more than the others, when Stella herself was no longer in my mind? Was it the sudden shift from weight to lightness, some hinge that made her body shift beyond breaking, or the attention she gave to each step, going to the bone of the movement with what appeared as inborn elegance, one that clashed with the disjoint chorus of the gloomy figures? At dawn, that silhouette of a Weimaraner, breath to bone, draws a dotted line parallel to the horizon. Like that dog, she runs through my dark landscapes, the same alertness, the same trust. Now, the last section I will read actually happens in the narrative before, because this is the piece, video. Luca eventually creates a video piece from that part of the surveillance film on which he happens to recognize Stella, who had been a former neighbor and Cora's mother. And this is outside of the perimeter of fear. This video has Cora and Luca meet because Cora comes across it in an artist's residency and has this shock of seeing her mother on the screen and asks to meet the artist, and it turns out that the artist is this former neighbor, and then they develop a story together and bring the story further. We can talk maybe later about how we use appropriations, because both Michael and spoke about it, and I also work with appropriations. Unlike Michael, I have chosen not to put the list of like a bibliography, because I thought in my case the material was very eclectic. And I think it would have given a false impression, or maybe have. I tried to insert a hint in every place where I, instead of giving the actual name of the author, but insert a hint of what that was. For instance, sometimes readers tell me, "Oh, this is a great line." And it's usually the lines that I've taken from someone else. And so one of the lines that has a lot of success is the found. The lost keeps the found in equipoise, and this is literally. I would have thought at least to mention the name of the author here, but I don't. It was just was a sentence that just struck me, and I wrote it down on a little piece, and so it's exactly what it is in the novel. And you'll recognize in what I read probably something at the end. There is. There are a few words from Joseph Brodsky, but not from his poems. His beautiful book, Acqua Alta, about Venice. And so I have inserted them as a poem at the end of this piece. I work very much with, because the word objet trouvé is mentioned, and it is what these boxes are, literally. I consider the appropriations I work with exactly as objet trouvé. Also considering the lives of these people, these broken lives, and sometimes, in other circumstances than the ones that inform the book. An object can be so important, or an object that one carries further, or an object that was left behind. And there is this beautiful poem that you certainly know by Elizabeth Bishop, The Art of Memory. I found these wonderful coincidences. We think of objet trouvé as something static, okay, as an object. But reading a lot about, while I was writing as much as I could from Mercedes Cunningham text and anything related to it, and watching, there is a wonderful memoir by Caroline Brown, who was one of his stellar dancers. And in this memoir, Chance and Circumstance, Caroline Brown recalls Merce requiring from the dancers absolute concentration on each single movement, as though the movements were objet trouvé. And I found very interesting that the relation of the movement itself can be an objet trouvé, so it's something that some kind of internal object exteriorized. So this is the video. This is not a video piece that I have seen. It is not a description. I have created it with words. And because we are here in a cross-artistic environment, I am launching a project, also because I worked on collaborations, and I have this fantasy of an cross-artistic project where students from writing or art programs find their own objet trouvé in novel and create something else of it. I myself, with my publisher's permission, after the book was published, I have chosen some fragments and used them in art projects associated with visual images. Untitled or Unknown Destination, circa 1992, installation, 16mm film, 2 television monitors, 2 glass stands. Other than the television monitors on stands facing the viewer at eye level, the room is empty. The same footage, black and white, eye-level shot, is running on both monitors in a loop, with only a vague variation in the image grain and the speed of the footage. One loop lags slightly behind the other. A nonchalant woman of an uncertain age, her shoulders and arms covered by a 3/4 sleeve dark cardigan, makes slow progress on the surface of a moving walkway, or so it seems. In spite of the weight she carries in one hand, a suitcase, a box, she radiates an ease that messengers do when they bring news which untangle some old knot. The woman stands out in a mass of pallid figures. As she closes in, 3/4 of her figure in view, a long shadow passes over her face, then exits the frame. Had she lifted her sunglasses over her forehead, her expression might have taken a different turn at that point. But as the slow mechanism carries her along, the woman's hair, just covering her ears, barely wavers while her face remains unnaturally smooth. Only her cardigan beats the air, as if stirred up by a breeze, or, as the scene was most likely shot in an airport corridor, by a rush of mechanically circulated air, something unnatural, fabricated. Her face draws closer, gets larger, and when it has almost covered the screen and her lips are about to sketch an imperfect circle, a freeze frame marks a pause. Then the movement carries on, but inversely, from front to back, more briskly now, briskly and accompanied by the hissing of a tape static. The woman's gestures, fluid just a moment ago, suddenly seem to crumple until only a visual echo remains of her silhouette. Then a blank screen before the cycle resumes, and a few lines unfold, white letters on a black background. Water equals time and provides beauty with its double. Run, my dog, run, a hostage to the night, I pray for you. Thank you.
So I guess this is a question that both of you probably have slightly different answers to. But how would you say you do, because your novel, Tokyo, has, you know, a kind of bibliography in the back and Stella doesn't, you know, though they both use quotes. How do you say that you do justice to a quote when its entire context has changed?
That's an interesting question. How do we do justice quote when its entire context has changed? I mean, I think about appropriated text in the way that I do with sort of visual collage, in the sense that one of the things that interests me about it is the ways in which, you know, let's say with the Rauschenberg work, right, where, you know, you take the project as it's presented to you, right, as his work, and yet there are all these sort of bits and pieces within it that you recognize that original context, right? And you know, there's this kind of interesting kind of vibration going on in you as a viewer of that work, and that, you know, you're lured back to the places where all that material came from, where what you recognize of it, but you're also, you know, sort of compelled to read it in its new context too. So, you know, in a sense, I mean, I would say I probably don't do justice to the entire quote all the time. I mean, in the case of the Rauschenberg, I mean, I may recognize Mickey Mouse, let's say, but then there's some other element of the image that I don't recognize. So I'm educated in some ways, but I'm ignorant in others, and I'm sort of like piecing it together. And you know, the points at which I'm educated may make me wonder more about those things that I don't know. So I'm kind of playing the same game with the reader, in the sense of, you know, maybe they recognize he couldn't ease up. The floor seemed to suck at the soles of his shoes. These are lines that are taken from a story by Mishima, a pretty well-known story called Patriotism. And I mean, I've just recited them to you as they are in my book, but the fact is, like, I took so much material, and I originally was splicing it, you know, sentence by sentence, then phrase by phrase, as you mentioned, then word by word. So in some cases, like, I don't even know what the original source was anymore. So in some ways, and people have mentioned this, you know, that they recognize the Mishima, but sort of hazily. I guess, you know, the way I try to sort of remediate my my abuse of the original is to give that bibliography, right? To sort of say, you know, that serves a little bit the same purpose as that sort of sequence of so-called documentary photographs, right? To say that there is a source for all this stuff, but you know, I'm trying to do honor to it, to sort of like give it its due, and you can go look it up, but I'm trying to make something new here too. Did you want to have a response to that, sort of like the
about how that changed? Yeah, it's but the same thing and different, because I just think that for those of us who live with books and art, these fragments that we use are part of who we are. And that's the case, I think, for any reader. Even if we just have this false separation, you know, this is art, this is life, this is what I've read, this is. But what we read is part of what we become. Not every book, but we know part of what we see. And yeah, I have the same problem in forgetting sometimes. Maybe I use sources that I don't remember, but those I remember are really like, you know, I think in my case, I think more in terms of the mosaic than a collage, because I have this image, like there are like little things that I find, little stones that I find, and I'm trying to bring them together, create a community. a community which I have in my mind, but a community of people who don't know each other. And that's why I have this fantasy of collaborations, because this is such an extraordinary way of not only bringing human beings together, but stimulating creativity across media. And the fact, like Michael using it, is fantastic to use visual material, because there are just two forms of energies. And for me, also, either the material that I have included, or other forms of art that have informed the book, and very often in the narrative sense. They give me solutions, either narrative solutions or formal solutions. And I found that very interesting when you watch something, somebody, do a drawing or a dance, or in a different medium. It's how does the body move? How does that? This is fascinating in Merce Cunningham work, because he introduces a lot, like everybody does it now, but when he did it was early on, everyday movements. So we are everybody. We can't do that as elegantly as his dancers. But, okay, how do we fall? Kickstart and fall is one of his choreographies. So it is that kind of the problem that I had with Cora. How does she's very awkward. There are moments where she describes that she trained very early as a teenager, but she's very awkward, and she's really precisely trying to fall with elegance. But this is, of course, a metaphor of, carrying all that weight and how to get out of it and be light, and like that image that you saw of Merce, fly out of it, which is not a form of denial, but it's just a form of respect for what was lost. There is a line in the novel, survival is no virtue, it's an act of love. And that was what she does. And also, besides the text and the material or stories that I have used for this novel, I have known a few survivors that were extremely elegant and extremely light. And that early on has been for me an extraordinary source of energy. So it's what I hope the characters do.
Hello, my first comment is about the discussion of recording that you both brought up. One either being documentary-like, or the other one being stumbled upon or personal aesthetics of recording in the sense of a memory. And so I kind of want to ask, how damaging, or is it damaging for an individual who wants to be a minimalist to try to choose certain objects that they want to keep or aesthetic memories, if that makes sense?
Dangerous. Yes, is that it?
Damaging or dangerous.
Damaging in certain circumstances, or
just like how as beings we like to accumulate things.
Yes.
We like, and so
Okay.
There's times where we want to get rid of things, but then it's hard to because of the memories that each thing ties to.
Yes. Well, it's part of, now I see better what you mean. Well, it's part of taking weight off. And in that particular fragment that I read, it refers to being, that's why I misheard dangerous and not damaging, because that's what I had in my mind. Certain objects, like certain words, in certain circumstances, can be very dangerous. So carrying certain objects at certain moments can be dangerous. And in certain circumstances, carrying one object is maybe just the only thing that you can carry. The key, for instance, the tiny key, is something that somebody told me 33 years ago when I arrived in France, somebody who had defected longer, and he showed me in his jeans, he said, I still have the key of my house. I left with it. I knew I would never come back. He left like all defectors, you know, with a little bag, pretending that nothing happened. I'll see you later. And that was the only thing. And he had defected at that moment 20 years ago. And that image stayed with me. He was carrying that key every day of his life in his pocket. So. So yes, let's be minimalist. Significant objects. I know that when you move or when you, every object is significant, but I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I'm just sort of thinking about how sort of the notion of minimalism, and to some extent, I suppose that's why, or a myth of minimalism, that something that drew me to Japan and Japanese culture to begin with is this sort of like, I don't mean this in a like a hygienic sense, but just sort of like this cleanliness of line, like of object, of space, you know, that I mean I call it a myth. I mean it's true, but also I mean there's this great book of photographs called Fruits, I think, that came out several years ago of the interiors of Tokyo houses, like people's apartments, and they're just like. I mean, you've probably seen plenty of images like this. Right? It was just crammed, packed, like with stuff. There's so many ways of sort of exploiting every inch of space because these houses are so tiny, and they're not particularly neat in all cases, right? I mean, it's just sort of like jam-packed with stuff. There is an interest, you know, in some parts of Japanese culture and collecting, right? The otaku culture of sort of like accumulating data. Like as well as, you know, objects in some cases. So, you know, I think there was an aspect of that minimalism, that sort of like cleanliness of line that drew me to, you know, sort of the images that I was creating to begin with, and that sort of was interesting to me about Japanese culture. But, you know, I think. That was certainly exploded in a lot of ways when I tried to depict Tsukiji, and the imagery that I use in that first section that I read. I mean, there are no frogs, there are no flowers, and these kinds of things. No women actually hand rolling sushi. This is a thing. So I got a lot of things wrong, but sort of the abundance, the overabundance, and ultimately what I didn't talk about there, but I think you probably saw in the images is I mean, there's a lot of violence to the body there. So in terms of sort of like creating the cleanliness of that slice of tuna on a finger-length piece of rice, block of rice, is a lot of messiness that goes, you know, as I tried to explore as I went through the book, like further and further back, all the way to the point at which that tuna, you know, is still in the ocean that has been poisoned by, you know, radioactive fallout from Fukushima, et cetera, right? So, you know, that attempt to, or the desire to be a minimalist is, you know, built on the back of a lot of pain, it seems to me, or a lot of like accumulation, as you mentioned. Which never goes away. And I think sort of going back to what you were saying about sort of how trauma is embedded in the body, you know, I think that was something that really sort of came back over and over again as I was working on this project. I mean, there is a hypothetical scenario in the third section where a Japanese writer is imagining this science fiction world in which these fish have been genetically engineered in order to sort of create or sort of bring back fertility to the Japanese population that has gone sterile through sort of years of sort of avoiding relationships, which is also kind of a thing. So, you know, and that fish, that genetically engineered fish is called Yamato, right, which is sort of like this sort of blanket term for the Japanese race. So there is this sort of inevitability of that pain, that initial trauma or refusal, let's say in this case, that comes back in, you know, sort of in any effort to try and sort of shrink down the possession, right? To sort of refuse accumulation. It always comes back, and I think, you know, I felt very yo-yoed in that sense by that image that I mentioned, right, of the woman in the body. What does it mean? And I think sort of going, you know, sort of investigating that image sort of brought me to this conclusion, back to that myth of minimalism, like that there's a lot of baggage there that just never goes away.
Something occurred to me while Michael was speaking, because you mentioned the word recording. And the counterexample, or the opposite of minimalism, would be those films, and them there were many, of surveillance, and today video cameras, but others really could be used, that don't mean anything. People were you know, doing this day and night. And actually, some of the images come from a documentary that I saw late at night, and for all this interesting documentary, past like at 2 o'clock in the morning, about a documentary that surprisingly survived, which I think that was the title, A Day in Poland, and it was in the 60s, and that's where I got the piece. I mean, it's a collage in itself. I didn't have to collage anything. They were there together. Chalk. I mean, it's you can write another novel just about this. Why were they interested in how? I think it occurred to me later, or somebody suggested that if you write like they didn't have spray to do graffiti, that why should chalk, how much chalk you bought, be important? And salt, I still, maybe because it was winter and the snows a lot, but it doesn't make any sense. Very much like the other form of recording, the secret police files, for some of the people who went to check them. There was nothing significant, but it's just this whole, so that would be a counter, almost, danger aside, a Borgesian, you know, fantasy of copying or making the map that is the worth itself. So yes, minimalism is.
All right.
I wouldn't do this unless I really wanted to ask this. So, first of all, thank you for sharing not just your experiences with Japan and Japanese representation, but also even mentioning otaku in an academic space, period. I'm like so hype right now, you don't even know. One thing I want to actually mention, because my original question was going to be rather on the bodily performativity of separated women, because it seems like women and performativity tend to show up in both your works, but rather just performativity in general in your works as well. You see this kind of transformation and kind of movement throughout what I've seen, especially from your work with the bisected woman and whatnot. I want to hear more about that. I'm sorry. I'm just like.
As far as the otaku, like there's this great book. There's actually a press based in Seattle called Chin Music Press that the editor was I think it was a newspaperman in Tokyo for a long time, and so a lot of their books are on Japan, translated by a Japanese. Actually, the woman who translated my work for Yamaguchi-san, the guy who runs that press linked me up. Anyway, there's a book called Otaku Spaces, and I think the guy's name is Galbraith. It's really cool, like great book. So yeah, so like otaku are like a thing, like academically too. So, but as far as performativity, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it's something that I didn't really talk about. The last part of the book is called Backstage, and the phenomenon of the onagata in kabuki was like hugely influential in my thinking about the book. In part because the narrative of that first report is Ito-san, talking about the tuna affair that happens at Tsukiji, and it's intertwined with his separation from his wife. Like he finds, not so much that they're connected in time, and he sort of feels compelled in some way to sort of, find that monster, right, as some indication of a need for action in relation to his relationship with his wife. But we never, other than a couple of letters, actually hear from the wife. And I realized as I kept thinking about the book, like, the woman in the tuna is like, this is a huge thing, and I felt like, where's the woman? Like, when does she get to speak? I can't exactly say that she ever gets to speak, in part because I wanted to emphasize the fact that it was always going to be my voice, no matter what. And so what interested me about the Onagata is that if those of you who don't know, kabuki is an all-male theater. It has been all-male since, I think, the 16th century. Maybe the 18th century. In any case, women originally began kabuki back on in Kyoto, but were eventually sort of like moved out, and in the same way that for the same reasons that complaints are often made about performers, right? That they are selling their bodies as well as doing these performances, etc. They were replaced by young boys. That became a problem as well. Sort of the accusations of pederasty, etc. And so it has been an all-male theater ever since. There have been sort of periods where women have come back on stage, but the Onagata as a particular kind of character. It's a male playing a female, and it is this incredibly stylized performance of femininity, right? And it's not the man being mistaken for a woman, right? Everybody knows it's a man, right? But he's performing the movements, the mentality, the gestures of the feminine, right? As I was working on this book, I read Mishima's story, Onagata, which, sort of plays on this. But there's a film by Kon Ichikawa from the 1960s called Revenge of a Kabuki Actor, or An Actor's Revenge. And the main character in it, actually, the actor plays two roles. He plays the Onagata that's the subject of the film, but he also plays this other guy, a thief, and who is, male all the way through. But it's set in the 19th century, so at that time the Onagata actors, they maintained their roles as women, as Onagata, through all their lives. So when they were in the theater, they were out of the theater, they were Onagata always. So what fascinated me about this, and this is a film made for Japanese audiences who understand, presumably, that the history of the Onagata and what an Onagata does. That the character, I think it's Yuki is the name of the character. He performs femininity for most of the film, but there's a point at which he seduces one of his rivals' daughter. And it's this incredible scene where he's performing both masculinity and femininity in this sort of seamless transition throughout the scene, so that he has this very kind of like what we would expect, sort of kind of a traditional masculine approach to seducing the girl, but there are moments where he pulls back into this kind of femininity, almost. It's not sexual. It's more of like a sisterly kind of conversation, and I was just so amazed by this. First of all, just to sort of see that in action, and then also to sort of think like, I don't think most American viewers would have any idea what the hell is going on here, right? And I wanted to try and capture that in this book, right? And sort of the ways in which I was, as an author, trying to embody that femininity of the wife, and the female version of S, who is sort of both male and female whenever she needs to be, and these kinds of things. So that's the approach toward performativity that I was taking was through that that particular figure, which again, I mean, it's my Westerners take on the Onagata, but that was kind of my model for trying to sort of get at the performances that I was undertaking as a writer to sort of assume the mask of the Japanese, right? To the Japanese man, to assume the mask of the woman, right? All these roles that I can't perform with any real authenticity, right? So I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, yes, thank you for the exquisite readings and this discussion. Anca, there's a moment in your reading when you talk about the films and you say, if I caught it right, they deserved my gaze, the character says. They deserved my gaze. It was for me to help them step into another light. And it just made me think about this discussion we're having about documentary materials. And sort of on the one hand, Michael, you talked about using documentary materials to inhabit other vocabularies, to let them speak for themselves, and there's that modality. But then there's this other mode of that the materials are being borne witness to, that I feel like that line that you read got at, that as a kind of mourning or repair, or to use one of the words you used, remediation, that they deserved my gaze, and that even though all that film that you described seems there's nothing going on, and yet it needs to be seen or mediated again, and you've remediated it through this character. And I suppose I'm partially thinking about this because I recently find myself responsible for and cohabiting with many boxes of materials of several deceased relatives, for reasons I won't get into. And I had this moment when you were reading that where I thought, really, it's been so overwhelming and confusing to know what to do with this sort of archive. But really the idea that it just deserves my gaze, this idea that it might be just to bear witness, to look at, just enough to look at. I have this sense of huge responsibility. What is meant to be done with this 100 years of material from all over the place? Anyway, yeah. So.
Oh yeah, thank you. Actually, it is more difficult than dealing with your own stuff because there is this sense of responsibility, and unconsciously I didn't think when I wrote that sentence, but when I read it every time I think, yes, this is, I think, what I meant to do with these stories that I've heard even before I knew I was going to write this novel, that these anonymous people, and Lucas says at a certain point, even if they were wherever they are, meaning dead or alive, it doesn't mean to them anything. It won't change their life, but it will displace their life into, it will give them a bit of an existence, just a little bit. And this issue of being looked at instead of looking is also very important for Cora, because she has grown up and created all these fantasies and wanted to see her mother again. And actually, she has a revelation in this video piece that I read, reappears later on in the novel. Here it's a personal narrator, and when it reappears, slightly changed, it's from the perception of Cora and with the emotional charge that happened when she saw it. And it ends by her revelation that what was more important, she realizes that it's not that she sees Stella, but that Stella looks at her. And paradoxically, from this film and these close-ups, and that brings her some kind of resolution to her problem. And that was something that just came up in the writing. But this question of responsibility is indeed, and I think also because we both write in also essays and academically, and I also felt that very often when I write about a writer or about photographers, it is a responsibility I was asked to write just very short contributions, a lot of work for an entry in a dictionary of women photographers. And I started doing research, and you find one in one place 1 year, in another place 1 year. It maybe doesn't matter, but for me it matters. She joined Magnum in 1945 or 1948. And so suddenly that took immense proportions, because many of these photographers were not really known. It was hard to find material, and I had just a few lines, and it occupied 6 months of my life. But you have to do it, and it will be there. You never know, objet trouvé, you never know when. But it has to be, well done and clear and precise. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us here. Thank you. A great public.
We have some books for sale if you are interested, down here at the front.